What if the life you were living was only a fraction of the story you were meant to inherit? What if a single, careless insult, hurled in a moment of anger, could unravel decades of secrets and lies, and in doing so, rewrite your entire destiny? For one struggling waitress, a single drop of spilled water would become a torrent, washing away the painful present and revealing a past more breathtaking and tragic than she could ever have imagined. This is a story about a tarnished silver locket, a billionaire's buried heart, and a test of character so profound it could either shatter a young woman's spirit or forge it into an unbreakable legacy. The stale, recycled air of the Lucille restaurant was a familiar perfume to Elena. It was a mixture of lemon-scented cleaner, expensive French perfume, and the underlying metallic tang of anxiety. For 2 years, this scent had been the backdrop to her life, the air she breathed for 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. At 24, Elena felt significantly older. Her dreams, once bright and expansive, had been put on hold, packed away like old clothes she might one day fit into again. Now, her life was a repeating cycle of sore feet, demanding customers, and the ever-present weight of her grandmother's mounting medical bills. Her grandmother, Clara, was the anchor of her world. She was the one who had raised Elena after her mother, Isabella, had passed away from a sudden illness when Elena was just a child. Clara's hands, now gnarled with arthritis, were the same hands that had braided Elena's hair, checked her homework, and held her tight through every childhood nightmare. But now, Clara's heart was failing, a slow, cruel decline that required medications with price tags that looked like phone numbers. So Elena worked. She took every extra shift, smiled through every condescending remark, and balanced trays of overpriced food with a grace that belied the exhaustion etched deep into her bones. Her online college courses in business management were a thing of the late-night hours, fueled by cheap coffee and a desperate hope for a future beyond tips and side work. Tonight was different. Palpable tension crackled through the restaurant. The corner booth, the one with the best view of the city skyline, was occupied by Arthur Sterling. Even if you didn't know his name, you knew his power. It radiated from him like a cold front, chilling the air around him. He was a titan of industry, a man whose picture was often in financial magazines with headlines that spoke of ruthless acquisitions and a net worth that defied comprehension. He was older, perhaps in his late 60s, with a severe face, a mane of silver hair, and eyes that seemed to miss nothing and approve of even less. Across from him sat a man named Marcus Vance, another heavyweight in the corporate world. The whispers in the kitchen were that this was a dinner to finalize a $3 billion merger. For Elena, they were just table 12, a table to be handled with extreme care. "More water, sir?" she asked, her voice soft and professional, as she approached the table. Arthur Sterling didn't even look at her. He was in the middle of a sentence, his voice a low growl of negotiation. "The Q3 projections are non-negotiable, Marcus. We absorb the infrastructure, or there is no deal." Marcus Vance, a man with a kinder face and a more measured posture, held up a hand. "Arthur, let's just breathe for a moment." He nodded politely at Elena. "Yes, please." Elena reached forward with the heavy glass pitcher. Her hands were steady, a practiced calm she had perfected over thousands of similar gestures. But as she tilted the pitcher, Sterling made a sudden, sharp gesture with his hand to emphasize a point. His cufflink, a glint of gold and onyx, caught the edge of the pitcher. It was a tiny, fractional contact, but it was enough. A small splash of ice water arced from the spout, landing not on the table, but directly onto a stack of important-looking documents watermarked with the Sterling Corp logo. The silence that followed was instant and absolute. It was as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. Arthur Sterling slowly lowered his gaze from the damp papers to Elena. His eyes, which had been cold before, were now glacial. The fury in them was so pure, so potent, it felt like a physical blow. "You clumsy, stupid girl," he hissed, the words low but sharp enough to cut. "Do you have any idea what you've just done? Do you have any idea the value of what you've just ruined with your incompetence?" Elena felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. Her heart hammered against her ribs. I'm so sorry, sir. It was an accident. An accident? He scoffed, a sound of utter contempt. Incompetence is not an accident. It's a character flaw. People like you drift through life causing problems for people who are actually trying to build things. Get out of my sight. Get me your manager. You're fired. Tears pricked at the corners of Elena's eyes, but she fought them back. Fired? She couldn't be fired. Not now. The rent was due. Clara's prescription needed to be refilled tomorrow. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She bowed her head, a gesture of complete submission. Yes, sir. I'm very sorry. As she bent forward, the delicate silver chain around her neck swung free from the collar of her uniform. At the end of it was a small, tarnished silver locket, oval-shaped and etched with a simple, swirling vine pattern. It was the only thing she had left of her mother. Sterling was about to turn his venom back to his guest when his eyes caught the glint of silver. He stopped. His breath hitched. The entire world seemed to tilt on its axis. He stared at the locket, his face draining of all color. The anger, the power, the arrogance. It all vanished, replaced by a raw, naked shock that was almost frightening to behold. He recognized it. Every scratch, every curve of the vine. It was impossible. Marcus Vance had been watching the exchange with growing disgust. He was a man who had built his own empire, but he had never forgotten his roots. He believed character was capital, and he had just witnessed a profound bankruptcy. Arthur, Vance said, his voice level but laced with disapproval. That was uncalled for. Sterling didn't hear him. He was still staring at the locket, his hand trembling slightly as he pointed a finger at it. Where? He said, his voice a choked whisper. Did you get that? Elena looked up, confused by the sudden, bizarre shift in his demeanor. It was my mother's. Your mother. The words were barely audible. What was her name? Isabella, Elena replied, her voice trembling. Her name was Isabella. The name struck Arthur Sterling like a physical blow. He staggered back in his chair, his face a mask of disbelief and a pain so deep it seemed to have been buried for a lifetime. He looked from Elena's face, her wide, dark eyes, the curve of her jaw, to the locket and back again. He was seeing a ghost. Marcus Vance stood up, placing his napkin deliberately on the table. I think we're done here, Arthur. Sterling finally tore his gaze away from Elena to look at his guest. Marcus, wait. No, Vance said firmly. I've seen all I need to see tonight. For weeks you've talked about synergy, about assets, about market share. You never once mentioned people. I just saw how you treat people. A $3 billion deal is built on trust, on partnership. I don't partner with men who find it necessary to destroy a young woman's dignity over a splash of water. The deal is off. He gave Elena a brief, sympathetic glance, then turned and walked out of the restaurant without a backward look. $3 billion. Evaporated. The whispers from the surrounding tables grew into a low murmur. But Arthur Sterling didn't seem to notice. The catastrophic financial loss was nothing. A background hum. His entire universe had just collapsed and reformed around the young waitress standing before him, a silver locket dangling from her neck like a key to a locked room in his soul. He looked at Elena, his expression now a maelstrom of confusion, grief, and a desperate, dawning hope. He stood, his movements stiff, and walked towards her. The other diners watched, rapt. My office, he said, his voice hoarse with an emotion she couldn't decipher. Tomorrow morning.
10 o'clock.
Sterling Tower. Bring the locket. Elena stared at him, bewildered. But, you said I was fired. You're not fired, he said, his voice shaking. Just be there. I will compensate you for your time. I will compensate you more than you make in a year. Just come. Before she could answer, he turned and strode out of the restaurant, leaving behind a chaos of stunned silence, a ruined business deal, and a young woman whose life had just been irrevocably, terrifyingly, and perhaps miraculously altered forever. The walk home felt unreal. The city lights blurred into long streaks as Elena replayed the scene in her mind. Each word, each look, each shattering moment. The humiliation of being called stupid, the terror of being fired, the utter strangeness of Arthur Sterling's reaction to her mother's locket, and his final command, an offer that sounded more like a desperate plea. She let herself into the small, second-floor apartment she shared with her grandmother. The scent of lavender and old books greeted her, a comforting contrast to the artificial world of the restaurant. Clara was asleep in her armchair, a worn quilt draped over her legs, the television murmuring softly. Elena watched her for a moment, the steady, shallow rhythm of her breathing. This was why she endured it all. For this fragile, fierce woman who was her only family. Quietly, she went to her room and sat on the edge of her bed. She unclasped the locket and held it in her palm. It was cool to the touch. Her mother had given it to her on her 5th birthday, just months before she died. "This will always keep you safe, my little star," she had whispered, her voice already weakened by the illness that would soon take her. "It's a piece of my heart, so I'm always with you." Elena had never opened it. The clasp was old and stiff, and a part of her was afraid of what she might find, or not find, inside. It was enough that it was her mother's. It was a tangible link to a woman she barely remembered, a face she knew mostly from a single, faded photograph on her nightstand. In the photo, Isabella was young, vibrant, her smile lighting up her entire face. She had the same eyes as Elena. Who was Arthur Sterling to her mother? Why did this simple piece of jewelry shatter the composure of one of the most powerful men in the world? The offer of a year's salary for a single meeting was ludicrous. It was the kind of money that could pay for Clara's medications for years, that could pay off their debts, that could let her finish her degree without the crushing weight of exhaustion. It was a lifeline, but it felt dangerous, a hook leading into dark, unknown waters. Sleep offered no escape. Her dreams were a chaotic swirl of Sterling's icy glare, her mother's smiling face from the photograph, and the cold, heavy weight of the locket in her hand. She awoke before dawn, the decision already made. She had to go, not just for the money, but for the mystery. For the first time in her life, a door had opened into her mother's past, and she had to have the courage to walk through it. The next morning, she chose her best clothes. A simple black dress, modest and professional. She braided her hair neatly and, after a moment's hesitation, clasped the locket around her neck, tucking it beneath the collar of her dress. Felt like both a shield and a piece of evidence. Sterling Tower was a monument of glass and steel that pierced the sky, a testament to the man's ambition. It was designed to make you feel small, and it succeeded. The lobby was a cavern of polished marble and silent, intimidating security guards. When Elena gave her name at the front desk, the receptionist's perfectly manicured eyebrow rose in surprise, but she checked her list and a flicker of recognition crossed her face. "Mr. Sterling is expecting you." Penthouse floor. An express elevator whisked her upwards, the city shrinking below her. Her ears popped as she ascended, a physical manifestation of her entry into a world impossibly removed from her own. The elevator doors opened directly into a vast office. 3 of the 4 walls were floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a godlike panorama of the metropolis. The 4th wall was lined with books. The desk was a slab of dark, polished wood, utterly bare except for a sleek laptop and a single, framed photograph turned away from view. Arthur Sterling was standing by the window, his back to her. He didn't turn when she entered. "Did you bring it?" he asked, his voice quiet, stripped of the previous night's venom. "Yes, sir." Elena's voice was a whisper in the cavernous room. He turned around. In the harsh morning light, he looked older, more fragile. The armor of his power was gone, replaced by a deep, hollow weariness in his eyes. There were dark circles under them, as if he hadn't slept at all. "Let me see it," he commanded softly. With trembling fingers, Elena pulled the locket out from under her collar. She unclasped it and held it out to him in her open palm. He didn't take it. He simply stared at it, his gaze intense and full of a profound sadness. He reached out a hand, his finger tracing the etched vine pattern, a touch so gentle it seemed almost reverent. 45 years, he murmured, more to himself than to her. I haven't seen it in 45 years. He finally looked up, his eyes meeting hers. They were filled with a question he seemed afraid to ask. You said your mother's name was Isabella. Isabella, what was her last name? Read, Elena said. Isabella Reed. A shudder passed through him. Isabella Reed, he repeated, the name an incantation, a memory brought to life. He walked over to his desk and picked up the lone photograph, turning it around. It was a black and white photo of a young couple, laughing on a park bench. The man was a young, impossibly handsome Arthur Sterling, his face free of the lines of cynicism and grief. The woman beside him, her head resting on his shoulder, was her mother, Isabella, younger than in Elena's photo, but unmistakably her. And around her neck was the locket. Elena gasped. She felt dizzy, as if the floor had dropped out from under her. You knew her. Knew her? Arthur let out a short, broken laugh that was more a sob. She was the love of my life. This was the first twist, the first key turning in a lock she hadn't even known existed. The cold, cruel billionaire who had humiliated her was a man who had loved her mother. The revelation was so immense, so world-altering, that Elena had to grip the edge of a chair to steady herself. He began to speak, the words spilling out of him as if a dam had broken after decades of pressure. He told her about meeting Isabella. He was a young man then, just starting to work for his father's formidable company, suffocating under the weight of expectation. She was a painter, a free spirit who worked part-time at a library to make ends meet. They met in a small bookstore, both reaching for the same volume of poetry. Their connection was immediate, electric. She saw me, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Not my name, not my father's money, just me. She was life. She made everything vibrant, real. My world had been shades of gray until she walked into it. He told her about their secret romance. His father, a domineering and class-obsessed patriarch, would never have approved of a relationship with a woman of her standing. So they met in secret, stealing moments in parks, small cafes, and art galleries. The locket, he explained, had been his first gift to her, purchased from a small antique shop with the first money he had ever earned on his own, separate from his family's wealth. She promised she would never take it off, he whispered, his eyes distant. What happened? Elena asked, her voice barely audible. Why did she leave? Because that was the story Clara had always told her. That Isabella had simply left one day, moving to a new city to start a new life, where she eventually met Elena's father, a man who had died before Elena was born. The details were always vague. Arthur's face hardened, the old pain returning. She left. One day she was gone. A letter was all I got. It said she'd met someone else, that she couldn't live in my world, that she was sorry. She returned every gift I had ever given her. Except 1 inch. He looked at the locket in Elena's hand. I tried to find her, for years, but it was like she had vanished from the face of the earth. My father. He told me to forget her, that she was just a gold digger who had taken a better offer. He sank into his chair, looking utterly defeated. I believed him. Eventually, the pain turned to anger, and the anger turned to this. He gestured around the opulent office, at the tower that bore his name. I built an empire on bitterness. I thought she had betrayed me. For 45 years, I have believed that. He looked at Elena, truly looked at her, and saw the echo of Isabella in her features. And then last night, I saw you, and that locket, and I heard her name, and I realized, she never told me she was pregnant. The air crackled with the unspoken truth. The man she thought was her father, the man she'd never known, was a fiction. The man sitting before her, the cold-hearted billionaire, was her biological father. The silence in the room stretched, thick with the weight of decades of secrets. Elena felt a storm of emotions warring within her. Shock, anger, confusion, and a strange, unexpected flicker of pity for this broken man. Arthur finally broke the silence. He cleared his throat, trying to regain some semblance of his usual composure, but his voice was still unsteady. I can't undo the past. I can't give you back a father or give myself back the years I lost. But I can help you. The things I said to you last night, they were unforgivable. A reflection of the man her leaving made me, not of who you are. He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. I want to make you an offer. Come work for me, here, as my personal assistant. The salary will be more than enough to take care of your grandmother, to finish your education, to give you the security you deserve. It's not a replacement for a family, I know that, but it's a start. It would give us a chance to, I don't know, to get to know each other, and to find out what really happened to your mother. Elena's mind reeled. A job, a salary that would change everything, an opportunity to understand the gaping hole in her own history. It was too much to process. Her life had been about survival, about the next bill, the next shift. This was something else entirely. This was about identity. Why are you doing this? She asked, her voice stronger now. Is it guilt? He looked at her, his eyes surprisingly direct. Yes, an ocean of it. But it's more than that. When I look at you, I see her. I see a chance, however small, to honor her memory, to right a fraction of a wrong that has haunted my entire life. Please, Elena, say yes. Looking at the man before her, she didn't see a titan of industry. She saw a man shipwrecked by a lost love, a man who had built walls of wealth around a hollow core. And in his offer, she saw not just a solution to her problems, but a path to the truth. For her mother, for her grandmother, for herself. Okay, she said, the word small but firm in the vast office. I accept. Elena's first week at Sterling Corp was a disorienting plunge into a parallel universe. The hushed, carpeted hallways, the quiet intensity of people in expensive suits speaking a language of mergers and acquisitions, the sheer scale of the operation. It was a world away from the clatter and chaos of the restaurant. Her new desk was in an office adjoining Arthur's, a space larger than her entire apartment, with the same breathtaking view of the city. Her salary, the first direct deposit of which had already appeared in her bank account, was so staggering it felt like a typo. She had immediately paid for a consultation with the best cardiologist in the state for her grandmother, a single act that lifted a mountain of weight from her shoulders. Arthur, for his part, was a man transformed in her presence. The cold, intimidating CEO she had witnessed at the restaurant was gone. In his place was a quiet, almost hesitant man, who seemed to be relearning how to interact with another human being on a personal level. He was formal, keeping their interactions strictly professional during business hours, but she would often catch him watching her with a searching, melancholic expression. He would ask her small questions about her life, about her studies, about her grandmother, gathering the fragments of the life he had missed with an almost desperate hunger. It was in her second week that she met Richard Sterling. He strode into her office without knocking, a man in his late 30s with a smile that was all teeth and eyes that were cold and assessing. He was impeccably dressed, radiating an aura of entitled privilege. "So, you're the new girl," he said, his voice smooth but with a sharp, condescending edge. He leaned against her desk, invading her personal space. "Richard Sterling, Arthur's nephew, and the chief operating officer of this little enterprise. I have to say, your appointment has caused quite the stir. No one seems to know where you came from. One day you're a waitress my uncle insults, the next you're his personal assistant with a corner office. It's a real Cinderella story." Elena met his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. Mr. Sterling was looking for an assistant. I was fortunate enough to be chosen. Richard laughed, a short, humorless sound. Fortunate. Yes, that's one word for it. My uncle is a creature of habit. He doesn't do spontaneous. He hasn't hired a personal assistant in 15 years. The last one retired. And then you come along. You must have made quite an impression. His eyes scanned her, a look that was both dismissive and deeply suspicious. Tell me, What exactly are your qualifications for this position? I'm a fast learner, Elena said evenly. I'm sure you are, he sneered. Well, a word of advice. My uncle is a sentimental old man, but this company is not. It's a shark tank. And you look a lot like bait. He pushed himself off the desk and straightened his tie. Just stay out of my way, and we'll get along fine. He left as abruptly as he had arrived, leaving a chill in the air. Elena understood immediately. Richard saw her as a threat to his position, his influence, and most likely his inheritance. He was the contemporary antagonist, the immediate hurdle in this strange new world. Her instincts told her he would not be a man to simply stay out of her way. Her duties were varied. She managed Arthur's schedule, organized his correspondence, and sat in on meetings, taking meticulous notes. It was in this capacity that she began to see the man behind the myth. He was brilliant, his mind sharp and incisive in matters of business. But he was also isolated, a man who commanded legions but had no one to talk to. She became his confidant by default. One afternoon, he called her into his office. He looked more tired than usual. I've been doing some digging, he said, his voice low, trying to find any records of your mother after she left. Old addresses, employment records, anything. There's almost nothing. It's like she wanted to disappear. My grandmother said they moved around a lot, Elena offered. She never really talked about why. Arthur sighed, running a hand through his silver hair. There's a part of the past I've kept locked away. Literally. My father passed away 20 years ago. When he did, I had his personal effects put into storage. I never looked at them. Couldn't bear it. Our relationship was complicated. He was a difficult man. But I think if there are any answers, they might be in there. He gave her a key and a storage unit address. I can't do it, he admitted, his vulnerability startling. But maybe you can. Look for anything related to the year she left. Anything with her name on it. Letters, journals, ledgers. I don't know what you'll find. But I have to know. The storage facility was a sterile, climate-controlled labyrinth on the outskirts of the city. The unit was packed with dusty boxes, ghosts of a life already lived. It took Elena hours of sifting through old financial records, bespoke suits sealed in garment bags, and boxes of decades-old cigars. Finally, in a heavy wooden chest tucked away in the back corner, she found it. A smaller, locked metal box. Taped to the top was a label in an elegant, faded script, Isabella. Her heart pounded. This was it. The key Arthur had given her for the unit also opened this box. With trembling hands, she turned the key in the lock. Clicked open. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was a stack of letters tied with a faded silk ribbon. Her mother's handwriting. And another stack in a bolder, more masculine script. Arthur's. She gently untied the ribbon. These were their love letters. She sat on the cold concrete floor of the storage unit and began to read. The letters painted a vivid picture of a passionate, secret love affair. Arthur's letters were filled with a yearning and a tenderness that seemed utterly alien to the man she knew. He wrote of their future, of a life away from his father's shadow, of building something that was theirs alone. Isabella's letters were even more powerful. They were full of life, of art, of a fierce, unyielding love for Arthur. She wrote about his kindness, the way he listened to her dreams, the way he made her feel seen. As Elena read, she felt she was meeting her mother for the first time, not as a sainted, distant memory, but as a vibrant, passionate woman deeply in love. But as she neared the bottom of the pile, the tone shifted. Isabella's letters grew more anxious. She mentioned Arthur's father, a man she called the patriarch. With a palpable sense of fear, she wrote of feeling watched, of a growing sense of dread. And then there was the final letter. It was on different stationery, the handwriting slightly shaky. It was dated the day she disappeared. My dearest Arthur, I am so sorry. I can't do this anymore. We both knew this was a dream, and it's time to wake up. I have met someone else, someone from my own world, someone who can give me a simple life. I can't be the woman you need me to be, and I can't live in the shadow of your family. Please don't try to find me. I'm returning your gifts. Forget me and be happy. Yours, Isabella. It was the letter Arthur had described. It was cold, clinical, and completely at odds with the passionate love expressed in every other letter she had written. Felt wrong. Felt like a lie. Then, tucked underneath that final letter, was a folded piece of paper she almost missed. It wasn't a letter. It was a copy of a ledger entry from a private account belonging to Arthur's father. It was a single-line item, a wire transfer for $50,000, a vast sum of money at the time, to Isabella Reed. The memo line read, "Final obligation." Elena stared at the ledger. This was the complication. The story Arthur had believed, the story that had poisoned his life, was that Isabella had left him for another man. But this suggested something else entirely. Payoff. A transaction. Had her mother taken money to leave? The thought was a painful betrayal of the woman she had just come to know through her letters. But then she reread one of Isabella's earlier, fearful letters. One sentence stood out, a sentence that hadn't made sense before. "He knows about my family back home. He said he knows my mother is unwell. He spoke of it as a family obligation I couldn't possibly ignore." A family obligation. Final obligation. It wasn't a betrayal. It was a threat. Arthur's father hadn't just disapproved. He had engineered the entire breakup. He had found Isabella's weakness, her own sick mother, Elena's great-grandmother, and used it as leverage. He had forced her to leave the man she loved, forced her to write that cold, cruel letter, and sealed it with a payment disguised as a choice. Her mother hadn't left Arthur. She had been ripped away from him. This was the second twist, the piece of evidence that recontextualized everything. Her mother wasn't a heartbreaker. She was a victim, and Arthur had spent 45 years hating the memory of a woman who had sacrificed her own happiness, likely to save her family. Elena returned to the office, her mind a whirlwind. She found Arthur staring out his window, a familiar, somber pose. She laid the letters and the ledger copy on his desk. "I think you need to read these," she said softly. "All of them." For the next hour, there was no sound in the office but the rustle of old paper and Arthur's occasional, sharp intake of breath. When he finished, he looked up at her, his face pale, his eyes filled with a dawning horror and a grief that was 45 years fresh. "All this time," he whispered, "all this time, I hated her for leaving me, but she was protecting me, and her family. My father, my own father, did this, the foundation of his life. The bitter certainty that had fueled his empire had crumbled to dust." It was in the wake of this revelation that Richard made his move. He had been watching Elena, his suspicion growing into outright hostility. Her frequent closed-door meetings with Arthur, the discovery of the old files. He knew something was shifting, and he moved to crush it. He called an emergency meeting with Arthur, presenting a file thick with documents. "It's Elena," Richard said, his voice dripping with false concern. "I'm afraid she's been compromised. We've tracked a series of encrypted emails from her workstation to a shell corporation owned by Kenji Tanaka. Tanaka was their biggest competitor, a rival company they were currently in a bidding war with over a crucial tech patent." "This is absurd," Arthur said, his voice cold. "Elena would never do that. The digital footprint doesn't lie, Uncle," Richard pressed, laying out printed logs. "IP addresses, timestamps. It's all there. She's been feeding Tanaka our bidding strategy. She's a corporate spy. The Waitress story, the long-lost mother. It was all a ploy to get inside. She played you." This was Elena's test. She was summoned to the office. Richard stood there, smug and triumphant. Arthur sat behind his desk, the evidence spread before him, his face an unreadable mask of conflict. He was being asked to choose between the meticulously fabricated evidence presented by his own nephew, his COO, and the gut feeling he had about the daughter of the woman he had wronged. "Is this true, Elena?" Arthur asked, his voice heavy. "No," Elena said, her voice clear and unwavering. though her heart was pounding. She looked directly at Richard, her gaze unflinching. "It's not true. This is a lie." "A lie?" Richard scoffed. "The evidence is right here. Are you calling our entire IT security department liars?"
No, Elena replied calmly.
"I'm calling you a liar. You did this. You must have planted it somehow. Because you see me as a threat." "A threat?" Richard laughed. "You're a glorified secretary with a sob story. You're a threat to nothing but this company's security." It was a crucial moment. Elena's entire future, her ability to care for her grandmother, her chance to uncover the full truth of her past, it all hung in the balance. She could break down, she could cry, she could plead. Instead, a lifetime of quiet resilience, of facing down hardship with dignity, came to the forefront. She turned her back on Richard and spoke directly to Arthur. "You have spent your whole life believing a lie about my mother. A lie told to you by a man you were supposed to trust. Now, his son is standing here, telling you another lie about me. You have to decide right now if you are going to let the past repeat itself. Do you trust the family that manipulated you, or do you trust the daughter of the woman you loved?" Her words hung in the air, a direct challenge. It was a test not just of her character, but of his. Had he learned anything? Could he break the cycle? Arthur looked from Richard's smug, arrogant face to Elena's steady, honest gaze. He saw Isabella's fire in her eyes, the same strength he had fallen in love with all those years ago. He had made the wrong choice once, believing the lie, and it had cost him everything. He would not make it again. He slowly gathered the papers Richard had presented and, without a word, dropped them into the shredder next to his desk. The machine whirred to life, chewing up the fabricated evidence. Richard's face went white with fury. "What are you doing? That's evidence." "No," Arthur said, his voice like steel. "It's garbage." He stood up, his full height seeming to diminish his nephew. "You are suspended, effective immediately. I want your office sealed, your computers confiscated. I am launching a full forensic investigation into our network, and into you. Now get out of my sight." Richard stared, speechless with rage, then stormed out of the office, slamming the door behind him. Arthur turned to Elena, his expression a mixture of relief and grim determination. "I believe you," he said simply. "Now let's find out just how deep this rot goes." He picked up his phone and dialed his head of security. "I need a private investigator, the best you can find. I want him to look into my father's records from 45 years ago, and I want him to find a man named Alastair Finch. He was my father's head of security back then. Find him. I don't care what it costs." The investigation moved with the speed and efficiency that only a billionaire's resources could command. The forensic IT team quickly confirmed that the evidence against Elena had been planted, routed through a complex series of relays to mask its origin. But the digital breadcrumbs ultimately led back to Richard's personal laptop. He had been sloppy, arrogant in his belief that no one would dare to challenge him. But the more shocking discoveries came from the private investigator. He was a former federal agent, a quiet, methodical man named Peterson who specialized in unearthing secrets people thought were buried forever. He located Alastair Finch, the old head of security, living in a quiet retirement community in Florida. At 85, Finch was frail, but his mind was sharp, and his conscience was heavy. Peterson flew to Florida. At first, Finch was reluctant to speak, bound by a loyalty that had spanned decades. But Peterson was persuasive, speaking of truth and closure. Finally, presented with a copy of the ledger entry Elena had found, the old man's dam of silence broke. He confessed everything, the words pouring out in a torrent of guilt. The story was even more brutal than they had imagined. Arthur's father, a man named Theodore Sterling, hadn't just disapproved of Isabella. He had been pathologically obsessed with maintaining the family's bloodline and social standing. He saw Isabella as a contamination. He had Finch investigate her, discovering her humble background and her mother's illness. That was the leverage he used. Finch described the meeting in chilling detail. Theodore Sterling had summoned Isabella to his office. He had laid it out for her in cold, simple terms. She would disappear from his son's life forever. In return, he would provide her with $50,000, enough to ensure her mother received the best care and her family wanted for nothing. If she refused, or if she ever tried to contact Arthur again, he would use his immense power to not only destroy her reputation but to financially ruin her entire extended family, ensuring her mother would die without proper medical attention. He made it clear he would also poison Arthur against her so completely that he would never take her back anyway. He forced her to write the cold, dismissive breakup letter right there in his office, dictating some of the cruelest lines himself. She fought him, Finch told Peterson, his voice raspy with age and regret. She had a fire in her, that one. She told him his money was poison. But when he talked about her mother, she broke. She cried, but she did what he asked. It was the only way she could save her family. The hardest thing I ever had to do was stand there and watch it happen. But the investigator's report contained one final, devastating revelation. A truth that would reframe Arthur Sterling's entire existence. It was the ultimate twist, the heart of the decades-long lie. After Isabella was gone, Arthur had been inconsolable. Theodore, seeing his son's grief, had delivered the final, cruelest blow. He hired actors. He staged photographs of Isabella with another man, making it look like she was laughing, happy, in love. He had Finch present this evidence to Arthur, along with a fabricated story that she had not only left him but had done so mockingly, calling him a fool for ever thinking she truly loved him. He told Arthur she had taken the money and run, a common gold digger who had played him for a fool. It was this lie, this meticulously crafted piece of psychological cruelty, that had finally broken Arthur. It was what had curdled his grief into a black, enduring bitterness. It turned his heart to stone and made him the cold, ruthless man he became. He hadn't just lost the love of his life. He had been made to believe that the love itself had been a fraud. His father had not only taken his future, but had also poisoned his past. And Richard, Peterson discovered, had known. Sifting through his grandfather's private papers after his death, Richard had found Theodore's journal, which detailed the entire sordid affair with a cold, triumphant pride. Richard had kept the journal, seeing it not as a family shame, but as leverage. It was the ultimate blackmail material to hold over his uncle, a secret he could use to ensure his own ascent to power. He knew the truth about Elena's lineage the moment he saw her, and his campaign against her was a desperate attempt to remove the one person who could inadvertently bring the entire lie to light. Arthur read the investigator's full report in his office, with Elena sitting in silence across from him. With every page, another layer of his life was stripped away, revealing the rotten core of deceit it had been built upon. The man he had feared and respected, the father whose approval he had spent his life chasing even after his death, was a monster. A cold, calculating sociopath who had destroyed him for the sake of pride and prejudice. When he finished reading, he didn't speak for a long time. He simply stared at his hands, as if seeing them for the first time. The hands that had built an empire were the hands of a man who had been a puppet his entire adult life. The grief was immense, a physical weight that seemed to bow his shoulders. It was grief for Isabella, for the life they should have had. It was grief for Elena, for the father she never knew. And it was grief for himself, for the man he might have been. Finally, he looked up and his eyes were clear. The bitterness was gone, washed away by the terrible, liberating truth. In its place was a quiet, cold fury, a resolve. "He won't get away with it," Arthur said, his voice low and steady. "Neither of them will." He looked at Elena. "Your mother was a hero. She sacrificed everything. It's time everyone knew the truth." He picked up the phone and called his head of legal. "Schedule an emergency meeting of the board of directors for tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Every single member is to be there. No exceptions." The atmosphere in the Sterling Corp boardroom the next morning was electric with tension and confusion. The board members, a collection of the city's most powerful and influential figures, murmured amongst themselves, speculating on the reason for the sudden, cryptic summons. Richard was there, looking pale but defiant, flanked by his own lawyer. He had been ordered to attend, and he clearly believed this was his chance to fight back, to paint Arthur as an unstable, sentimental old man being manipulated by an outsider. The doors opened and Arthur Sterling walked in. But he was not alone. Elena was by his side. She was no longer dressed as an assistant, but in a simple, elegant navy blue dress. She looked poised, her quiet dignity a stark contrast to Richard's barely concealed rage. Arthur took his place at the head of the long, polished table. He didn't sit. He stood, commanding the room with a renewed authority, but it was an authority tempered by a gravity they had never seen in him before. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," he began, his voice calm and resonant. "For the past several weeks, there has been a great deal of speculation regarding certain personnel changes within this company. Today, I am here to end that speculation. Today is about the truth." He looked directly at Richard. "Richard, you have accused this young woman, Elena Reed, of corporate espionage. You have presented me with what you claimed was irrefutable evidence of her betrayal." Richard's lawyer started to speak, but Richard waved him off, a smirk playing on his lips. "I did, and the evidence speaks for itself. She is a danger to this company." "Indeed," Arthur said, his voice dangerously soft. "A danger to your lies." He gestured to the large screen at the end of the room. It flickered to life, showing the forensic IT report, detailing in excruciating technical detail how the evidence against Elena had been fabricated and tracing it back to Richard's own computer. The murmurs in the room grew louder. Richard's smirk faltered. "This, however," Arthur continued, his voice rising, "is not just about a pathetic attempt to frame an innocent employee. It is about a lie that has been at the very heart of this company and my life for 45 years. He then began to tell the story. He told them about Isabella Reed, the brilliant, vibrant woman he had loved. He told them about his father's prejudice and the cruel, calculated campaign to drive her away. He presented the ledger of the payoff. He then played a video deposition. On the screen appeared the face of Alistair Finch, the elderly former head of security. Finch, his voice trembling with the weight of his confession, recounted the entire story. The threats against Isabella's family, the forced letter, the fake photographs, the systematic poisoning of Arthur's mind by his own father. The boardroom was utterly silent, captivated by the tragic, sordid tale. Elena stood by Arthur's side, a living testament to the story he was telling. When the deposition ended, Arthur's gaze locked onto his nephew. "And you knew," he said, the words falling like stones. "You found your grandfather's journals. You knew Isabella was forced out. You knew she was pregnant. You knew Elena was my daughter. You knew I had spent my life believing a lie that destroyed me. And you said nothing. You kept it as a weapon. And when Elena appeared, you tried to destroy her, just as your grandfather destroyed her mother." All eyes turned to Richard. He was cornered, exposed. The veneer of corporate civility was stripped away, revealing the ugly, arrogant entitlement beneath. There was no remorse in his eyes, only rage at being caught. "So what?" he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "My grandfather did what was necessary to protect this family's legacy. He saved you from a woman who was nothing, a piece of trash from the gutter who would have diluted our blood and our name. And this one," he sneered, pointing a trembling finger at Elena, "is no different. She doesn't belong here. She never will." The confession, born of pure, unadulterated arrogance, hung in the air. He had admitted everything. His own words had sealed his fate. Arthur Sterling looked at his nephew, not with anger, but with a profound and weary pity. "You have learned nothing from him but his cruelty. You are not a Sterling. You are just his shadow." He turned to the board. "Richard Sterling is terminated from all positions at this company, effective immediately. His shares will be bought out, and he is to be removed from the premises. Furthermore, our legal team will be pressing charges for corporate espionage and fraud. As for my father, Theodore Sterling, effective today, his name will be removed from all company buildings, foundations, and letterheads. His legacy is one of deceit and cruelty, and it will no longer be honored by this company. He then put his hand on Elena's shoulder. And I would like to introduce you to the newest member of this board and the head of our newly formed charitable foundation, the Isabella Reed Foundation for the Arts and Education. My daughter, Elena Reed. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Richard Sterling, stripped of his power and wealth, became a pariah. The legal case against him was airtight, and he faced the humiliating prospect of prison time. The story, when it inevitably leaked, became a media sensation, but Arthur, with Elena's guidance, controlled the narrative. It wasn't a story of corporate scandal. It was a story of a long-buried truth finally coming to light, of a father finding his daughter, and of a company dedicating itself to a new, more ethical path. The Isabella Reed Foundation became Elena's passion. With the vast resources Arthur placed at her disposal, she created scholarships for underprivileged art students, funded community centers, and supported families facing overwhelming medical crises. She was no longer just surviving. She was building a legacy of compassion in her mother's name. Her grandmother, Clara, with the best medical care money could buy, made a remarkable recovery. Her heart condition stabilized, and the light returned to her eyes as she watched her granddaughter, once a weary waitress, become a force for good in the world. One of the first calls Arthur made was to Marcus Vance, the man who had walked away from the $3 billion deal. Arthur apologized, not for the lost deal, but for his behavior. He told Vance the entire story. Vance was silent for a long moment on the other end of the line, and then he said, "Character is capital, Arthur. It seems you've just made the most significant investment of your life." The next week, they were back at the negotiating table. The deal was reborn, but this time it was a true partnership, built on a foundation of mutual respect and a shared commitment to ethical business practices. Arthur Sterling himself was a changed man. The bitterness that had defined him for nearly half a century was gone, replaced by a quiet sense of purpose. He found more joy in approving a scholarship through Elena's foundation than he ever had in a corporate acquisition. He was gentler, he listened more, and sometimes Elena would even see him smile, a real smile that reached his eyes. He was finally free from the prison his father had built for him. Months later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, Arthur and Elena stood together in a quiet, sun-dappled cemetery. It had taken them a while to find Isabella's grave, a simple, modest headstone in a small, forgotten cemetery 2 states away. Elena placed a bouquet of vibrant, colorful flowers at its base. "She would have been so proud of you," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the tarnished silver locket. He had had the clasp repaired. "I think it's time we finally open this." Gently, he worked the tiny clasp. It sprang open. Inside, on one side, was a tiny, perfectly preserved photograph of a young Arthur. On the other side, instead of a picture, there was a tiny piece of paper, folded into a minuscule square. With delicate fingers, Elena unfolded it. On it, in her mother's handwriting, were 4 words. "My true north, always." Tears streamed down Elena's face as she read the words. It was a message of undying love, hidden away for decades, a final testament to a love that had been stolen but never extinguished. Arthur put his arm around his daughter's shoulders, and they stood there together, 2 souls connected by a shared past of pain and a shared future of hope, finding solace in the truth at last. The locket, once a symbol of loss and mystery, was now a symbol of reunion, of a love that had, against all odds, endured. The world can often seem to reward the cruel and punish the kind, can feel as though dignity is a liability and ruthlessness a virtue. But as this story shows, the truth has a power and a patience all its own. A single moment of integrity, a single act of standing firm in one's own worth, can be the catalyst that brings down an empire of lies. True wealth is not found in stock portfolios or corporate towers, but in the strength of one's character and the love we have the courage to honor. A life built on deceit, no matter how grand, is a house of cards, ready to collapse at the slightest breath of truth. So, what lies in your own life are waiting for a moment of courage to be exposed? If this story touched your heart and reminded you of the power of truth and dignity, please like and share it with others. Subscribe for more inspirational stories that celebrate the strength of the human spirit.